Hi everyone, this is Chapter 4, Psychoanalytic Therapy. And obviously for this one, we will start off with Freud. So let's start off with the introduction. We want to make sure that you all read Sigmund Freud's mini bio in the book, but here is a quick review. Freud's work influences contemporary psychology, which basically means that everything that has occurred since in terms of psychology most likely has been influenced by Freud when he first started and created this. Basic concepts are still part of the foundation that other theorists base their frameworks upon. So you might have heard even the word Freudian slip. You've heard of people talking about their childhood. Those are all things that Freud, he himself, created first before anyone else. Some expand while others modify, and some are against it. So expanding basically means we have this material, we're going to make it even more, right? Whereas modified basically means we have all the stuff that he's given us, but we're going to change some of those things. That's what modified means. And then some are against it. So let's say that we talk about in Freudian terms how the mother may be at fault for raising their children a certain way. There are some theories that go, no, 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 that's not right at all. We're going to go against it. And this is really what's going to happen. Remember, like we talked about before, a lot of this is generational. So you have to think about Freud back in his time where women did not have as many rights and stuff like that. So therefore, you would assume that women were seen as less as, right? But in modern times, in the 2000s, things have changed drastically. So that means that they're going to go against it. Psychoanalytic system is a model of personality development and an approach to psychotherapy. It focuses on the unconscious. Unconscious is basically things that are happening that you're not aware of. First, therapeutic procedures for understanding and modifying the structure of one's basic character. So this is the beginning of starting to analyze people for who they are as a person. So at the beginning of each chapter, there's going to be a section called Key Concepts. And it talks about how this specific framework views human nature. And in terms of psychoanalytic or Freudian, it is considered deterministic. Deterministic is how our behaviors is determined by irrational forces. Irrational forces means things that just happen, right? It doesn't need to make sense. Unconscious motivations, which are things that we don't necessarily even know sometimes why we want these things, we just do. Biological and instinctual drives in the first years of our life, also known as the psychosexual stages. Biological and instinctual basically means things that you are born with, it's part of you, right? And drive in psychology is just a fancy word for saying motivation. So we also have biological or things that we're born with where it makes us want to do certain things. Instincts are central to the Freudian approach. So again, how we feel inside, kind of like how our gut feeling is what happened. Originally used the word libido and later changed to life instinct. So libido was usually what he called it. However, libido in today's world really just means kind of like sexual desires, as opposed to all these different things that are considered motivators or drives. Survival of the person and the human race, such as growth, development, and creativity, are part of that. So sometimes there are things in our bodies that make us want to do things, and there's a reason why, and that is to make sure that the human race continues. So for most of us, we have an instinctual or biological drive to have sex with other people. And then for that reason, when you have sex, for most people, you will most likely have a child, right? Or many children. So then that kind of continues on. Why do we have that instinctual drive? We don't necessarily know. It's just part of the biology to make sure that we keep on reproducing and continuing living. Okay? May start off with sexual energy, but moves past. A lot of it is about gaining pleasure and avoiding pain. Sometimes we do things just because we want to, because it feels good, right? We don't necessarily think about the consequences or why we're doing it. It just feels good, so we do it. Freud also talks about death instincts, and death instincts are considered aggressive drives. And aggressive drives basically means that part of us, for some reason, sometimes wants to die. So we do risky things so that, maybe that's the reason is because we kind of want to die, but we don't necessarily die. I would say something like bungee jumping, right? So jumping off a bridge with the bungee jump, or paragliding, or, roller coasters and stuff like that. Those are not necessarily typical stuff, but you do feel like you want to die, right? Or you're going to die when you are doing it, for most people anyways. And so that also factors into this as well. So it's the unconscious wish to die or to hurt themselves. In terms of structure of personality, there are three systems called the id, the ego, and the superego. On the side, there is a video on YouTube that's connected. Please go and watch that. And now we can actually go and explain each of these things. Okay, the id. All the untamed drives or impulses that is connected to the biological component. So untamed basically means not taught, not regulated drives or motivations or impulses that is connected to the biological component. This is considered the original system of personality because we're born with these things because it comes from us innately, right? At birth, people are all id, or mostly unconscious, because we don't really know why we're doing the things we're doing. We're babies. So there's a lack of organization. We're kind of considered blind. We don't know what's going on around us. We're demanding, and we are insistent. Has to discharge tension immediately. So whenever there's anything wrong, your body as a baby wants to stop it, right? Ruled by the pleasure principle. Reducing tension, avoiding pain, and gaining pleasure. Illogical, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to make sense. It doesn't necessarily have morals to it, amoral, and driven to satisfy instinctual needs. Like we said before, let's say that if a baby is hungry, the baby's going to cry, right? And then other people will go, oh, the baby is crying, maybe it is hungry. And so we're going to feed it. And that feels good because it's eating food, it's feeling good. So therefore, now it's satisfying that pleasure principle. Okay, the id is also known as something that never matures because we always want to feel good, right? And that means that we might be considered remaining kind of like a spoiled brat if we don't go further than that. Does not think, only wishes or acts. So it's like that impulse, right? Where you don't necessarily have a real reason, you just want to do it because it feels good. The ego is the next part. Organizes and mediates between the id and its list of realistic dangers of impulses. So this is showing you that there's actually some structure, some order, right? So it organizes and mediates. Mediate means let's talk about this, right? Between the id, which is the impulsive stuff, and a list of realistic dangers or impulses. So in today's society, we do have rules, so we cannot do certain things, right? So the ego is that thing that kind of manages that. It has contact with the external world because now you're saying, oh, it's not all about me. There's a community of people around me as well. So what I do may affect other people. It governs, controls, and regulates the personality like a traffic cop. It mediates between the instincts and the surrounding environment. It controls consciousness and exercises censorship, which basically means that it is now going, okay, other people can see what we're doing. So maybe certain things that we want to do, we should do it, out of sight of other people at our home or something in private. But in public, you should not do those things. Reality principle is what operates this. Like before with the id is the pleasure principle, right? The ego is the reality principle. It's realistic and logical thinking and formulates plans of action for reaching those needs. Intelligent and rational. It checks and controls the blind impulses of the id. So again, it is intelligent, so it's aware of what's going on. It's learned to be an adult or a human in society. And now it's saying, okay, there are certain things that we can do outside, and there are certain things that we should do inside, like in our own privacy. Can tell the difference between imagination and the external world. Before, in the id, it's like, oh yeah, this is fantastic. This is the perfect thing, everything. Here, we now know that there's also a reality that other people see us as well. And not necessarily just our fantasies that we have. So as you get older, you will see that your ego is the one that's managing what's going on. And the third component is called the superego. Its internalized social component, the expectations of parental figures. So you often see this as kind of like the law or the parent, right? Whenever you hear the word internalized social component, that kind of talks about how one should behave in society. Okay, there's a moral code, which is saying, you want to do this, you want to do that. This is good considered in society. These things are not considered good. Are your actions good or bad, right or wrong? This is where it decides whether or not that, and that's dictated by how society is saying. It's like saying, if you're driving, you should drive on the right, right? And then the other people passing by in the other direction should be on the left. When there's a red light, you should stop. When it's a green light, you should go. The reason why is because with that, now we all understand that we all behave in a safe, professional manner as a driver, right? Um, it represents ideals and strives for perfection and the traditional values and ideals of society, such as parent to the child. So just imagine the superego being the parent teaching the child how to behave and in a adult and professional, respectful manner. It tries to stop the id because remember the id is very childlike, right? Where it's kind of like I'm hungry, I'm just going to eat this, as opposed to as an adult you have to realize that there's people who make money off of food, so you can't just go to a restaurant, eat it, and then run, right? No dine and dash. And so if I want to eat this food, I'm going to have to pay for it. And it tells the ego, sorry, this is to say the ego, to move from moral goals to realistic goals. So the ego is now trying to tell that person, hey, let's do this in this specific way because this is how the real world is. We're not all rich. We don't have all that money. So maybe we'll go somewhere else that is much more affordable. So in terms of rewards, you feel good about yourself or you have pride in yourself and you love yourself. In punishment, when you're doing those things that are wrong, you're going to start to feel guilt and you might feel inferior, less than other people when you compare yourself to other people. Now let's shift towards consciousness and unconsciousness. This is keys to understanding behavior and the problem of the personality. The unconscious cannot be studied directly. We see it from behaviors. So unconscious means things that are hidden kind of underneath. We don't know why people are doing it. The only way we know about it is because people are doing things. So we're like, oh, so what's really the story behind that? So maybe it's someone who hurts animals, right? We don't know why they're doing it, but they're doing it. And we know we're going to wonder what's going on in their unconsciousness that's making them do this. So these are other areas where you can also look to see their behaviors and see what's going on, right? Dreams. Freud was very big on dreams, symbolic of the unconscious needs, wishes, and conflicts. In your dreams, when you're sleeping, your world is an endless fantasy. It can do anything, right? I'll give you an example. I had a dream once where I was riding a Pegasus, which is a flying horse, across the sky. That's not realistic, right? But why did I dream that? Is that something unconscious that represents something to me that I need to be aware of, right? 2, slips of the tongue and forgetting. That's also known as Freudian slips, right? So in that sense, sometimes we say things and then we go, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't what I was thinking or meaning. But for some reason, your mouth or your voice said those things. So then people are like, oh, I wonder what's going on there that, that made them decide to say that accidentally. 3, post-hypnotic suggestion. So you can go under hypnosis and then see what happens there, what is revealed there. 4, material derived from free association techniques. Free association techniques are things like wordplay. So maybe I'll say the word bird, and then you're going to go, whatever comes to your mind. And you might say feather, and then I might say worm, and then you might say penis. And you're like, oh, whoa, what's that all about, right? So then they can see what the terms are, what the range of the words are. Is there a relationship amongst all those words in terms of free association? 5, material derived from projective techniques. Projective techniques is basically in psychology, you are exposed to some images and then you have to interpret or explain what's going on. So it could be very, very ambiguous, like it's like an ink blot test, right? So it's just a bunch of messy dots or whatever, but someone might say, I see a motorcycle in here, and maybe there's a motorcycle that has affected that person in their life before. Maybe they fell off of a motorcycle and almost died one time. Or maybe they look at the projective test and it's like, do you see the old lady or do you see the young lady? Why is it that you see one over the other first? There's also scenic ones where it's kind of like a picture of two people interacting, but it's very, very vague. And then the person will ask, the psychologist will ask, tell me what you see in this scene. And then the person might go, oh, this man is an alcoholic and his wife is trying to help him and all that other stuff. So that is considered a projective because you're projecting what you're feeling or your thoughts onto this image. And 6 is symbolic content of psychotic symptoms. So again, sometimes the behavior you have, you will do things that may represent something else, and we're trying to figure out what that is. Consciousness is a small part of the mind. The larger part exists below the surface of awareness. So things that you are aware, in psychology, they're going to say you're aware of it, right? But it's not a lot compared to all the stuff that's happening underneath where you don't really know what's going on. Unconscious stores all experiences, memories, and repressed materials. Repressed means put away to the side. We're not going to think about it. We might pretend like it doesn't even exist. It needs motivations that are inaccessible. So sometimes you just don't know that you have these things. And that's what Freud is talking about, is that in psychology, that we are all oftentimes more mysterious than we are. How you psychologically function exists outside of this awareness. And the reason why people do the things that they do is because of all the stuff that we don't see, right? Psychoanalytic therapy is to make the unconscious motivations conscious so that you can make a choice. So in psychoanalytic therapy or Freudian therapy, we're trying to make those things that are unconscious, those things that are hidden, come to surface so that we understand why. And when you can do that, then you can start to choose what you want to do. But if it's hidden and you don't really know why you're doing the things that you're doing, you're just going to keep on doing it, right? But now, once we bring it out to awareness, you can now make a choice. Need to cling to old patterns or repetition must be worked through. We are also people who are creatures of habit. So we tend to do things that we know we feel comfortable with. So by making things more conscious, like, oh yeah, the reason why you keep on having or meeting or dating people that are not good for you is because of your need for family or something, or your childhood was not very good. So at least now that you understand it, you can stop these cycles if you want to. So this is a really good example of what Freudian psychology is often about, which is like an iceberg. So just like in the movie Titanic, the iceberg on top, which is the visual part, you can see it's big. It's not small. However, all the stuff underneath it is so much more. And this is the reason why the Titanic sank, is because it hit such a huge iceberg without even knowing it, because the iceberg top part, the part that's above water, you saw it's really small. It's not very, very big. But underneath it is such a vast amount. And it's heavy and strong and can be destructive. Now let's talk about anxiety. Feeling of dread that results from repressed feelings, memories, desires, and experience that emerge to the surface of awareness. So anxiety, that kind of weird feeling, you kind of at the pit of your stomach, you feel guilty sometimes with anxiety, you feel scared with anxiety. So that's what it is, right? So it says feeling of dread that results from repressed feelings. So the things that you're hidden are pushed away, hiding it. Maybe that's what's causing you to feel these things. So we want to learn and see what those things are. The state of the tension that motivates us to do something. It conflicts from ego, id, and superego, and then warns us of impending danger. So anxiety is not a bad thing, right? When we only concern about anxiety is when it's happening to us all the time. If it's happening to us all the time, maybe there's something going on, right? But a little anxiety is not bad for everyone, because that also kind of says, oh, you better do this, so that, you can relieve that stress or that worry, right? And also, sometimes your anxiety is because you know that whatever you're doing that makes you feel good is bad, right? So you have anxiety because of it. Or warning us of impending danger. So if you see a bear coming at you, you run, right? I think you're supposed to run or get away from it anyways, right? And so that's your body, the instinctual drive for you to start running or to protect yourself. Now let's talk about the three types. The first one is reality anxiety, which is the fear of danger from the external world. And that's the most obvious. If you see a bear coming at you, you run. You are feeling scared, you're feeling anxious, right? Number two is neurotic anxiety. Fear that the instincts will get out of hand and cause one to do something and get punished. So you know that these things feel good and you do it and you know you're like, oh, what if I get caught? I'm going to feel bad about it, right? But it's something that feels just so good. Three is moral anxiety, and that's a fear of one's own uh, conscience. Yeah. People who have a well-developed conscience tend to feel guilty when they do something against their moral code. So, for example, what the moral anxiety would be, you know that stealing is bad, so you don't do it, right? Because in your head, you know it's bad. When the ego cannot control anxiety by rational and direct methods, it relies on indirect methods called ego defense behaviors. Now let's talk about ego defense mechanisms. There is a YouTube video that shows a woman kind of acting out certain ones, but we can also talk about that as well in class. It helps a person cope with anxiety and prevent the ego from being overwhelmed. So here's the thing. We have a lot of things in our lives, right? Some of it causes a lot of anxiety, and some of it does not cause that much, but we have a lot, and we can become overwhelmed. So what our body does, or at least what psychoanalytic Freudian people thought, was that we would maybe put certain things to the side, pretend it's not there, all those different things, so that we have a sense of order, so that we don't get overwhelmed. Okay? Normal behaviors that can have adaptive value as long as it does not become a permanent way to confront the world. So, as long as you are doing things as you're supposed to as you go along living life, that's fine. But if everything has a high level of anxiety, maybe that means that something is not working or something you need to resolve. Okay. And this is why people go to therapy, right? It's because everything is overwhelming. Well, that should not happen. You can either deny or distort reality, or it can operate on an unconscious level. So the different ego defense mechanisms are as follow from the book: repression, denial, reaction formation, projection, displacement, rationalization, sublimation, regression, introjection, identification, and compensation. Please look at the book at table 4.1 because it shows you the definitions and examples. I'm not going to go through it in this chapter, like right now, but there's also a supplement to our course, and we can review that in class as well so that you can actually really see the examples, but I'm not going to do it in this lecture. Now let's talk about development of personality. The importance of early development. In psychoanalytic and Freudian, they really do focus on your childhood quite a bit. Okay, they're also known as the psychosexual and psychosocial stages of development, birth through adulthood. So, in terms of psychosexual stages, it's the first 6 years of life, and there are three parts to it. That's the oral, the anal, and the phallic stages. So oral stage is when someone has an inability to trust oneself and others, which results in fear of loving and forming close relationships and low self-esteem. So Freudians will say, let's associate that with what happens with breastfeeding. Okay, maybe something is going on. Maybe the child is not being breastfed, so then that could potentially affect them. Again, this is very controversial because of the generation at that time. There's also well documented things that talk about the fact that his mom was really pretty, and he's kind of a ladies' man. So maybe there's a little bit more to this than meets the eye when it comes to that. The anal stage is the inability to recognize and express anger, leading to the denial of one's own power as a person, and there's no sense of autonomy or no sense of being able to do something on your own. In the anal stage, it's often correlated to the time where babies are potty trained. Okay, maybe they make a mess and then their parents yell at them and make them feel shameful about it, right? And so then they feel no power. However, if a child is properly potty trained, maybe they feel successful, they feel like they can do anything on their own. The third part is the phallic stage, the inability to fully accept one's sexuality and sexual feelings and accepting oneself as a man or a woman. Also very, very controversial as well, because for him, penis or having a penis is power. So women often have this thing called penis envy, which means, hey, how come I don't have a penis, right? And then there is like a lot of talk about that. And there are people who have come back and said, this is nonsense. So you'll see these three sexual stages as something that some people will welcome, while others are like, no, this is all, dumb, right? And that's it. If the child's needs are not met during these stages, the child may become fixated at that stage and exhibit those behaviors in later life. So, for example, the oral stage, maybe the child was not breastfed, right? So as they grow up, they become a smoker because there's something in their mouth all the time. They're trying to make up for that time period when they were young, when they did not get, let's say, the nipple. Now let's talk about Erikson's psychosocial perspective. Studied under Freud and then expanded it by talking about psychosocial aspects, psychological and social tasks that each child needs to master from infancy to old age. Development occurs throughout life and divided into crises and other resolutions. You might have heard of Erikson because he is very popular with child development. Okay? And he talks about the fact that as we go along in our lives, there are certain moments in our lives where we have to make a decision. Okay, and that decision is also known as a crisis. Okay, so in this term in psychology, a crisis doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's just a moment in time where now we have to decide how we want to do. Do we want to stay the same and stay stuck there, or do we want to change and then go forward, hopefully? So in crisis, turning point in life, do we move forward or do we go back to a previous stage because it's much more easier to deal with? So that would be puberty. That would also be, let's say, going to college. That would be, getting married. Those are all considered major moments in our lives that we have to make a decision. The classical psychoanalysis is in psychology. Instincts and intra-psychic conflicts are the basic factors shaping personality and development. So in classical psychoanalysis, which is old school psychoanalysis, we focus on the motivations behind that. In contemporary psychoanalysis, which is much more like, today's version of it, is ego psychology. Does not deny the id, which means, yeah, we understand that you have motivations and you have drives, but emphasizes the striving of the ego for mastery and competence. So we're saying, you know what? But we're an adult now, we live in society, so let's see how we're able to manage ourselves in public, at home, and stuff like that, which is ego management. Okay? So on this slide is table 4.2, which compares Freud's psychosexual stages to Erikson's psychosocial stages. So in Freud, the oral stage, remember, which is all about like the nipple and breastfeeding, it's known as trust and mistrust. So does that child feel like they can trust the parent or not trust the parent to give it all the things that it needs? The anal stage, remember that's like potty training. In Erikson, it's also known as autonomy versus shame and doubt. Remember, autonomy, can that child get potty trained properly? Can it go number 2 in the toilet properly? Or maybe it's learning, but it's messy and it got its, a little bit of poop on its hand or whatever, and then it presses it against the wall and gets the wall a little messy and stuff like that. And then the parent comes and yells at that child. The child might not necessarily feel like they know what they're doing and they feel shameful or embarrassed and stuff like that, as opposed to being told, oh, try again next time. Let's see, don't do this or don't do that or use toilet paper next time, so forth and so on. The phallic stage is also comparable to the initiative and guilt, which is, can you do the things that you say you want to do? Latency stage is industry versus inferiority, is do you feel like you can become successful or not? The genital stage is also known as identity versus role confusion, so do you know who you are? And then the genital stages continues until young adulthood, which is intimacy versus isolation. Are we willing to be in a relationship and compromise, or do we feel safer being alone because we know that we can just make our own decisions for ourselves all the time, as opposed to being in a relationship with someone else? Middle age is generativity versus stagnation. So this is the time where you start to think, am I doing good for the world? Am I contributing to society and helping it? Or am I not? And then later in life, it's called integrity versus despair. And that is when someone is close to dying and they look back at their lives and they go, you know, that was a good life. As opposed to, oh no, I'm not done with everything. And, I wish I could have done all these other things, but I didn't do it for one reason or another. And then you feel sad about it. So as you can see in Freud's terms, it's usually, I would say, up to like 12, 13 years old, and then it kind of continues as that, and that's it. It doesn't go any further in terms of different types of evolutions. Whereas in Erickson, he goes from birth to death by saying that there are all these different crises that each person will go through around that time period, right? And then how do they deal with it? Now let's talk about the therapeutic process. Therapeutic goal is to increase adaptive functioning through reduction of symptoms and resolutions of conflict. So that's kind of general, right? Where basically what's going on is people have problems in their lives, and they're struggling with it. So the goal is to fix that or help fix that. So in psychoanalytic or Freudian therapies, there are two goals. Number one is to make the unconscious conscious. Remember that iceberg that we were talking about before? There's a lot underneath. Let's try to learn a little bit more about the stuff that's underneath as opposed to the stuff that we already see outside. Two is strengthen the ego so that the behavior is based more on reality than cravings or id or guilt, which is the superego. So basically to manage your ego to make sure that it's in check, right? You don't let the id or the superego means like don't do anything because it's going to be bad or whatever or unsafe. Whereas it is like, let's do everything, and who cares if it's unsafe, right? So it's about ego management. Childhood experiences are reconstructed, discussed, interpreted, and analyzed. So when it comes to your therapy, you're going to talk a lot about your childhood. Now let's talk about therapist function and role. So this is you as a counselor. There's a thing called the blank screen approach, which is an anonymous stance. So you're kind of like, I don't know what's going on. Little amount of self-disclosure and also encouraging a transference relationship. So what that is saying is, as a counselor, as a therapist, they should not know anything about you so that they can project things to you. Okay? Believing that if the therapist shares very little, whatever the client feels towards them is based on feelings they have with important people in their past. So the way that they treat you might be the way that they treat other people around them as well, because they don't know who you are, right? This may mean that they have unfinished business to address with that therapist. So they might try to get through those other people through you. They will help clients be able to love, to work, and to play, to achieve self-awareness, to become honest with themselves, and more effective personal relationships or have more effective personal relationships. It handles anxiety in a realistic way, and it gains control over impulsive and irrational behaviors. So by doing therapy, by going to therapy, you're going to be able to control your id and superego. Requires a lot of interpretation, which is uncovering the unconscious. Interpretation means reading into it, right? So they might talk about their dreams. How are those dreams interpreted? Pay attention to the client's resistances. Resistances is when you maybe as a therapist offer to do something and they're like, no, I don't want to do that. So now we're trying to figure out why is it that they don't want to do this, right? That's a resistance. Gaps and inconsistencies in the story. So sometimes they'll tell a story that just doesn't make sense. You want to think about why is it that it doesn't make sense. Infer meanings from dreams and free association, those techniques that we talked about earlier, and feeling towards the therapist. See what's going on. How are they treating you? What does that mean and how is that going to be interpreted when it comes to that person's life? Now let's talk about the client's experience in therapy. Classical psychoanalysis is long-term therapy. It means years, okay? Lie on a couch for free association, say whatever's on his or her or their mind. So they might come in and then the therapist is like, tell me what's going on. And then they just talk with whatever. That's free association as well, okay? Feelings, experiences, associations, memories, and fantasies are discussed. Client does not see the analyst's face. Why do you think the client shouldn't look at the analyst's face? One reason is because maybe your face is very expressive. So when they say something controversial or uncomfortable, you make a face. And that happens sometimes for some of us. We will change our attitude or change what we're thinking about so that we don't necessarily, let's say, offend the therapist or scare the therapist or make the therapist embarrassed, right? So instead of doing that, we don't want to have them look at us so that they can be free of anything and they can be themselves. Free to express any ideas. There's no censorship, so they can talk about whatever. Analysts, no judgment, asking questions, making interpretations, and allows for the client to regress into childhood. So in this sense, we're going to allow them to go back into a child and behave and talk about themselves as that child, and so that we can understand during those psychosexual stages. Here's a picture of Freud's office. So you can see there's a nice comfy, like kind of lounge chair that the person may lay down on. And then next to it, behind it, is a green chair where he may have sat so that he could still hear what the client is talking about, but doesn't necessarily have their face being revealed. Okay? This is always really interesting because I ask my students, how do you feel about this? And some students will say, oh yeah, it looks really warm and inviting. And then other people are like, oh, it looks so dusty. It probably smells in there. Again, generationally, very different. So again, it's always fun to hear your students' responses to that. The psychodynamic therapy is a shorter therapy. Psychodynamic is now the more recent contemporary therapies. It's a shorter therapy, does not use all the techniques from classical psychoanalysis, and encouraged not to make major life changes during therapy, to keep the defenses loose, and it's face to face. Okay, so in more recent versions, therapy is seen face to face as opposed to not seeing their face. Okay. Also encouraged not to make major life changes during therapy. So they're exploring and taking things from the unconscious to the consciousness. So we're not asking anyone to do anything, make life changes during that time. We want to just we just want to make sure that they're aware of those things are happening. Both people agree to terminate their sessions when both agree that symptoms and core conflicts are understood. So again, we finish with our relationship, our therapeutic relationship, when we both are aware of what has happened. Has the goals been met? Okay. Have we accepted the emotional problems that emerged? See a historical root to those issues, like, what happened in your childhood that caused you to feel this way now. They master their core themes, so now they're aware of what's going on in their lives. Insight into how the environment affects them and how they affect the environment. Reduce defensiveness. So before, we might go, oh, I'm going to pretend like that's not a big deal, right? But now we're like, you know what? That is a big deal. And now we're aware of it, so now we can move along. Integrate awareness of past problems with present relationships. So now you can realize, oh, that relationship with my mother is the reason why I'm not in such a great relationship with my girlfriend right now, or something like that. Let's talk about the relationship between the therapist and the client now. In classical psychoanalysis, stands outside the relationship. So in that sense, the therapist is not part of that person's life. In contemporary psychodynamic therapy, it develops a relationship with the client. So it's a working relationship, an alliance still. Focuses on the here and now as well as the past. Transference was something that we heard about in the previous slide. That's a client's unconscious shifting to the analyst of the feelings and fantasies that are reactions to significant others in their past. So what that means is the client is treating the therapist like someone in their life. Okay, so they're going to repeat those patterns that they do with their friends and family to the therapist. So they're transferring it. Okay, for change, transference must be worked through exploration of unconscious materials and defenses. So that's something that the therapist might work with them to resolve when they treat them the way that they are being treated by their client. Countertransference is when a therapist responds in irrational ways, lose objectivity in the relationship because their own conflicts are triggered. So countertransference is the other way around. As a therapist, you might see your client as someone in your life. So you start to treat them like someone in your life. Let's say it is an 18-year-old lady, and she reminds you of your daughter, right? So, and let's say that this client of yours is bringing up problems and then you feel guilt about something that you did to your daughter, and so now you're trying to put it onto this client instead. So that's counter transferences when the therapist or the counselor puts it on the therapist, okay? And that's not a good thing, typically. Let's talk about the application of the therapeutic techniques and procedures. So again, like we talked a lot about with the unconscious and consciousness, we want to increase awareness, fostering insights into behavior. So showing them, oh, this is the reason why you're doing the things that you're doing. Understanding the meaning of symptoms, going from talk to catharsis to insight, working through unconscious materials. So going from talk, which means just talking back and forth, to catharsis. Catharsis is a Greek word for kind of like a revelation or a breakthrough, like, aha, oh, now I get it. That would be considered catharsis, okay? So just from talking about what's going on to like, oh, this is why I'm doing the things that I'm doing, which provides insight. And then from there, you're allowed to then now start working on it now that you're aware of these insights, right? There are 6 basic techniques in psychoanalytic framework. Number 1 is maintaining the analytic framework. Number 2 is free association. 3 is interpretation. 4 is dream analysis. 5 is analysis of resistance. And 6 is analysis of transference. And we've talked a little about each of those, right? But let's go through each of them right now. Maintaining the analytic framework. Analyst relative anonymity, right? So again, that means that you are going to be a blank slate, right? You're not going to let them know a lot about you so that they can treat you the way that they treat other people in their lives. So you can observe those things. Maintaining neutrality and objectivity, again, being neutral. You're not going to respond to it. You're just learning and observing how they treat people. Regularity and consistency of meetings. So another thing is to be neutral, is to always be there when you say you're going to be there. Starting and ending the session on time, which means, again, organized and stable, right? Clarity on fees. So you want to talk about those fees and basic boundary issues. Let's talk about free association. Encourage to say whatever comes to mind, regardless of how painful, silly, trivial. Trivial means not important. Illogical, which means it doesn't make sense. Or irrelevant, which means it's not connected to anything at the time, as it may seem. Tool used to open the doors to the unconscious wishes, fantasies, conflicts, and motivations. So by doing that, we're hopefully being able to understand that person a little bit more into what's going on underneath everything, the unconscious part. Therapist's job is to identify the repressed material that is locked into their unconsciousness. Nothing the client says should be taken just at face value. Look for the hidden meaning. So they might say something like, sometimes I feel like, I'm really sad, right? So we don't really know why they're saying that. So let's say why they're saying those things. Or, life is really unfair, right? What does that mean? We're trying to understand the hidden meanings behind all of those things. Below here is a YouTube clip about a Freudian slip or a slip of the tongue, which is also part of the free association, because sometimes we say things and we don't even realize what we're saying. So let's watch that and then continue with this lecture. Now let's talk about interpretation. Analysts pointing out, explaining, and teaching the client the meanings of behaviors that is manifested in those dreams, the free association techniques that we're using, resistances, like when we decide when we don't want to talk about something, or the client says that, therapeutic relationship itself, like how is it between us? So you want to interpret those things and let the client know. And this shows the client's personality, the client's past, and contributes to their barriers. Like, so how are they doing it? What are they doing to themselves? The therapist can gauge clients' reactions for readiness to make interpretations. So as you get to know this person, you're going to let them know these interpretations as you go along, but you want to make sure that they're ready for it. Because if you start to interpret things and they're not ready for it, they might resist, right? So again, you have to be sensitive to when you should reveal these things or talk about these things. when the interpretation is close to the client's conscious awareness, and start with the surface and then go deeper as the client can handle. So start off with, hey, this is what you're saying. This is how I'm interpreting or how I'm seeing it from the conversations that we've been having. You have shown me many times where I see these themes and patterns pop up that will make me think that this is what's going on. Dream analysis, uncovering the unconscious materials for insight. The royal road to the unconscious. That's a very famous phrase that he said. Some motivations are so unacceptable to the person that they are expressed in symbols instead of directly. So sometimes in our dreams, we have these weird things, and those things are because of the anxieties that we have, and it turns into this kind of fantasy figure. So we hear about, let's say, performance anxiety. Someone who's going to speak in front of the class and do a presentation, they might have a dream where they go to school naked, right? Or their teeth are falling out, or they're being chased by some large, scary animal or whatever. So those are things that our body's like, oh, I can't handle it. But let's kind of deal with it, at least in dreams, being replaced with symbols of other things, right? And so we want to be aware of those things. And there are two levels when it comes to dream analysis: latent content and manifest content. Latent content is the hidden symbolic and unconscious motives, wishes, and fears. So some are so painful and threatening, the unconscious sexual and aggressive impulses that make up latent content are transformed into manifest content. Manifest content is what the dream is as it appears to the dreamer. Okay? So the process from latent to manifest is called dream work. So latent content is the scary stuff that we are experiencing in our mind, in our brains, right? We don't know how to deal with it. So what happens is in our dreams, it becomes something else. It manifests into this. So like I told you before, I had a dream where I was riding a horse, a flying horse, a Pegasus. So the Pegasus, the flying horse, is the manifest part, right? The latent part might be a sense of freedom because I'm flying around in the sky with a horse, right? So maybe the freedom is the latent content, but the manifest content would be the actual Pegasus horse. Or in a dream where you see a fire, the fire is the manifest, right? But what does it really mean? Does that mean that there is some sort of underlying stress that I'm going through, that I see this fire in my dream? Okay. Therapists will ask the client to free associate. Therapists will explore the dreams with the client and unlock the repressed issues that contribute to present problems. So here's some often seen dreams is like falling from a building. So the building is the manifest, right? But what is this tall building? That's the latent part. Like, what does it mean? That's the latent part. It could be a presentation that you have to do the next day, or maybe it's about proposing to your partner to get married and you're really scared. And the other photo is of a train going through a tunnel, which oftentimes people will say is a sexual dream, right? And so you can understand why people might think a train going through a tunnel is sexual, right? So there might be dreams about your fear of sex or your need to have sex so you're not having it or whatever. Okay, analysis and interpretation of resistance. So reluctance to bring to the surface or awareness unconscious materials that have been repressed. So this is the time where you were trying to work with your client, but they're going to say no for some reason. So we want to understand and interpret why they're resisting. Used by the client to defend against anxiety and pain that can appear with awareness. So maybe the client doesn't want to talk about it because they don't want to go through the feelings of sadness, stress, guilt, or whatever. So they're resisting it, right? So like, oh, that's interesting. Resistance is designed to protect that person. Again, they're not ready to deal with it yet. That's why they're resisting, right? Clients may wish to stay the same and change at the same time. Yeah, they're coming to therapy because they know that they need to work on stuff, but sometimes they're not necessarily just ready for it yet. Safe environment is stress to the client to reduce resistance. So that's why having a comfy place, an office where, everything is like, fabric and stuff like that will ease or make them feel a little bit safer so that they can do these things and talk about it. Analysis and interpretation of transference. Transference is valuable because it provides the client an opportunity to re-experience a variety of feelings that would otherwise be repressed. So by allowing your client to put those feelings they have to their friends and family onto you as a therapist, you are now able to have them feel those feelings, and then also a time for them to now react to it in a different way potentially. Clients can recognize how they are repeating the same patterns in their relationships with the people in their present lives. Maybe they talk to you like a servant, and the problem is that they're talking to their partners like they're servants as well. So then we can talk about, why do you feel like you're better than other people, or why do you treat people like help as opposed to a partner? So now let's talk about psychoanalysis applied to group counseling. As a useful tools will be transference, countertransference, resistance, and ego defense mechanisms to reduce anxiety. So those are things that we've all discussed, right? And so now you can see how it works in a group setting instead, because what happens is, now let's say client number one is going to treat client number two like a sister, but treat client number three like a mother, and then treat client four like their best friend. So now you can actually see a lot of transference happening at one time by the personalities that exist within a group. And that's something that will be very interesting. In group settings, attraction, anger, competition, avoidance with transference, and countertransference. Each member could remind them of different family members and therapists in a parental figure. So they might even see you like their mother or the father because you're the therapist in this whole thing, right? And then now you can sort of see how they treat everyone, and you guys can work from there. Jung's perspective on development of personality. Jung is one of Freud's proteges, very brilliant, very interesting man. And he started to kind of say, I disagree with some of that stuff. And then Freud was like, what? I no longer owned you. You are no longer my disciple or my protege. But Jung is actually a very well-known psychologist, and his stuff is really into balance and religion as well, and also collective unconsciousness. So let's talk a little bit about that. So analytical psychology is explanation of human that combines the ideas from history, mythology, anthropology, and religion. So the way that we have these ideas of folklore, the stories that have existed that keep on coming in, there must be a reason why those things exist. And that's what Jung is saying. Okay? So those stories of lessons learned, what does that all mean? Why is that part of our world? Why is religion so important to us? How does that fit into all of this? So he's very into that type of world. Central importance on the psychological changes that are associated with midlife. We need to let go of the values and behaviors that guided the first half of our life and confront our unconscious. So he's saying, forget what happened when you were younger. Let's just deal with what's going on right now. Okay? So you want to pay attention to your dreams that you have. Engage in creative activities such as writing or painting. Because when you're expressing those things without words, let's say, in paintings, something else might come and emerge. Or writing, even like unconsciously, just writing all these things, not thinking about what you're writing, and then reviewing it and seeing what's going on. Give into our unconscious forces and integrate them into our conscious life. Sometimes people will do drugs. You'll hear about that, mushrooms or LSD and stuff like that, because they're trying to unlock something in their unconscious mind, right? And so maybe that's something that we need to consider or think about as well. Like a lot of other psychologists you'll see, Jung based his framework on his own life. So he examined his own life, and this is how things pop up. Same thing with Freud as well. Jung could not support Freud's theory of sexuality, he didn't agree with that, and focused on the spiritual approach to finding the meaning in life, instead of how Freud is saying, the meaning of life is a biological or psychological urge or drive or motivation. He sees finding the meaning of life differently. He does not believe that we are merely shaped by our past events, like Freud said. Remember, Freud is deterministic, right? Which means that the way that you had lived your life when you were younger determines how you will react now. And Jung disagreed with that. He believed that you influenced by our future as well as our past. Human nature is constantly developing, growing, and moving towards a balanced and complete level of development. So his is about reaching harmony. Our bodies, our mind, and all that stuff. The way that we have these problems, we're just trying to balance it all out. Personality is who and what we have been and what we aspire to be in the future. So not only who we were and how we acted when we were younger, we also are aware that we want to be a certain way later on in our future. So maybe we're a mixture of those two, a balance of those two things, future and past. Humans tend to move forward or toward the fulfillment of all their capabilities. So he believed that we all have goals and we're going to try and reach them, and that's it, right? Whereas to other people might go, no, not necessarily. Jung also talked about individuation, which is the harmonious integration of the conscious and unconscious aspect of personality. So that's our goal is to remember to bring those things to awareness, right? But we also want to realize that there needs to be a balance of those two. We have both a constructive and destructive side. So when you think about Star Wars, that's what he's talking about. He's referring to Jung, right? It is essential to accept that we have a dark side or the shadow, which is being greedy and being selfish. But just because we have it doesn't mean that we need to let it rule, right? We can be greedy, we can be that, but we also want to realize that being good, being moral is more important than that, okay? And that we are all a little bit of both. There's no one who's like perfect all the time. Is there? I don't know. Then let's talk about collective unconscious. The deepest levels of the psyche containing the accumulation of inherited experiences of humans and pre-human history or species. So what that is saying is we have memories from our previous generations that were passed on to us. And those people had memories from their ancestors passed on to them. So what is this collective power? How is it that how does that work with our minds and our thinking? Because there are some connections in the world, right? And that's what Jung is talking about. Some dreams may deal with an individual's relationship to a larger whole, such as a family, a universal humanity, or even generations over time. So even in the dreams, when we interpret it, maybe it's talking about our histories as humans, right? Or as animals and stuff like that. Jung also talked about archetypes. Archetypes are images of universal experiences contained in the collective conscious. So we're talking about persona, animus, and shadow. So whenever we watch a movie, typically there's a hero component, there's a villain component, there's a helper component. So all of these things are considered archetypes of society, right? So if you look at this wheel, you see outlaw, jester, lover, caregiver, everyman, innocent, ruler, sage, which is a smart person, a magician, a hero, a creator, explorer. So these are things that we have and we look for those characters. The persona is a mask, the public face that we wear to protect ourselves. The animus or the anima is a biological and psychological aspect of masculinity and femininity, which exists in both sexes, right? Men, you are not all just full of testosterone. You do have estrogen in there as well. And same as women have also estrogen, which is the more dominant one, but they also do have testosterone as well. So we cannot think about things in just like, all or nothing, because that's not true. We all are kind of on a spectrum in that way. And then the shadow, the deepest roots and is the most dangerous and powerful of all the archetypes. This is the destructive side, right? On our dark side, the thoughts, feelings, and actions that we tend to disown by projecting them outward. So we blame other people for those things, as opposed to understanding that it's really us. There are two purposes for dreams. The prospective, which is to help people prepare themselves for events that they anticipate in the future. So like, let's say you had to do a presentation. So you had a dream about presenting naked or whatever it is that people have dreams about, right? Or they go take a test and then they miss their test or they oversleep or something like that. And there's also compensatory function, which is working to bring about a balance between opposites within the person. So maybe you are a very shy person in real life, but in your dreams, you are kind of very confident and all that stuff. So it balances each other out again. We hear about that with Jung a lot, right? Balancing. We can compensate in one way or the other. Contemporary trends, object relations theory, self-psychology, and relational psychoanalysis is the next part. So psychoanalysis is still evolving, and they're also known as the neo-Freudians. There's ego psychology, which we talked about, which is the emphasis on the id, the ego, the superego, and Anna Freud's defense mechanisms. Anna Freud adapted psychoanalysis to children and adolescents as well. Objects relations theory is how our relationship with other people are affected by the way that we have internalized our experiences of others and set up representations of others within ourselves. So object relation is basically, we have all these people in our lives. How do we set them up? How do we see them? How do we treat them? Um, and that shows us how we are ourselves, right? Self-psychology is how we use interpersonal relationships. So how we communicate with others to develop our own sense of self. So as you learn to socialize in the world, how does that affect who you are as a person? And then relational model is therapy is an interactive process between client and the therapist. The therapist is no longer the power figure over the client. It's a relationship between the two. So now let's talk a little bit about the stages of development for some of the people who are related to Freud in the sense of being his students. There's the object relations theory, which is created by Margaret Mahler, who's a pediatrician. Challenges the phallic stage, like I said before, many women do challenge the phallic stage, men too, because women were treated differently and seen differently during Freud's time, right? She focused really on the first 3 years of a child's life. There's normal infantile autism, which is the first 3 to 4 weeks of life, where you're talking about responding more to states of physiological tension than psychological process. So during this time period, children are not thinking necessarily. They're just saying, I'm hungry, so I'm going to cry, I'm going to do this, or I need a pee, or whatever it is, right? Object relations would be how they connect to the breast, the face, the hand, and the mouth, because those are things that they see, right? But they also don't realize that they themselves are actual beings yet. They're just, like I see a nipple and a breast, I want that because I know that that's going to feed me. So that's all I want. But they don't really know who they are. They don't even know that they necessarily exist, if that makes sense. Symbiosis is the 3rd to 8th month is pronounced dependency on the mother during this time. So it's a relationship between the two, right? Because I depend on you, you depend on me, or at least we see each other that way. So the next part is separation and individuation, which is the 4th to 5th month. Experiences separation from significant others, yet still turn to them for a sense of comfort. So a child might see their parent leave the room, right? And they're like, oh no, don't leave. But when they come back, they're able to understand that there's still comfort in that, right? Children who do not experience the opportunity to differentiate or can idealize others, as well as having a sense of pride, can develop a narcissistic characteristic. So let's say that if the child is not able to connect with other people, it's just one person, then it becomes more about them and how they cannot handle certain things, right? Typically, you would want your child to be able to be comfortable with other people around as well, not just the mother, let's say, or the father, but like the siblings, the cousins, and strangers as well. Narcissistic personality, grandiose, which means like really big, really fancy, an exaggerated sense of self-importance, and an exploitative attitude towards others, masking a frail self-concept. So what happens is you're using other people to benefit you because you yourself are very inferior. Borderline personality disorder, or BPD, crisis ensues when the child does develop beyond the stage of symbiosis, but the parent are unable to tolerate this beginning individuation and withdraw emotional support. So what may happen is sometimes parents will react in a way where like, oh no, my child's no longer needing me. So they might do things to make them need them more, right? And so that can unfortunately stifle some types of development as well. The lack of clear identity, a lack of deep understanding of others, people, and then poor impulse control and inability to tolerate anxiety. So let me just say it one more time. Lack of clear identity, a lack of deep understanding of other people, poor impulse control, and inability to tolerate anxiety can have this child acting out. And during this separation individuation, you want to move towards consistency of self and object. 3 years old, children can relate without being overwhelmed with fears of losing a sense of individuality. So now let's talk about brief psychodynamic therapy, which is again Freudian, but faster version of it, right? Called the brief version. All right. It applies the principles of the psychodynamic theory and therapy into 10 to 25 sessions. So typically, again, Freudian is long-term years, but the brief version can be reduced down to here. So you want to talk about the psychosexual stages of that person. You want to talk about their psychosocial. So, like, how did they deal with those crises during those moments when they were given those crises? Existence of unconscious processes and resistance. Again, to recognize that sometimes people don't want to talk about things so they're not ready yet. So then let's figure out what's going on. Usefulness of interpretation. Importance of the working alliance. So you're working together as a team. Reactment of the client's past emotional issues in relation to the therapist. So remember transference, we're talking about that. Not for people with severe characterological disorders or severe depression. So if you remember in the podcast that we listened to from Invisibilia, the woman was basically like, oh, that sounds like a severe characterological disorder, so I cannot help you, right? So this is what I'm saying. This is more of everyday problem type stuff, as opposed to very serious stuff. Now let's talk about psychoanalytic therapy from a multicultural perspective. The strengths of this is that Erickson's psychosocial approach is applicable to people of color. Okay, so what Erickson took of Freud does work on people of color. The shortcomings or the areas that may be a little bit more difficult would be it's expensive. It's based on upper and middle class values, so it's about richer people's lives, right? And then some cultures do not like the unstructured approach. Some people want homework assignments, and here we're talking about a lot of talking, right? And so for some people that might feel uncomfortable for them. There are some limitations and criticisms of psychoanalytic approach. And again, like I said before, and you all know, not everyone likes everything, right? Some of us hate everything. Some of us hate certain things. Some of us hate, whatever, right? So again, psychoanalytic, again, not everyone's going to like it. So critics say that they ignore empirical research, which basically means experiments, proof, like research based, because a lot of it is your opinion. How do you feel right now, right? As opposed to showing me how you've changed your behaviors. So it's not as empirical as other ones like cognitive behavioral therapy. Time, expense, availability of trained psychoanalytic therapists, extensive analysis of transference. Again, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of experience to be a person who is working in this field. Anonymity is not a good model for effective therapy, as people will say, because they wanted you to do it as like a team, right? But in psychodynamic, anonymity is required so that they can do transference. Feminist framework says that the relationship between the mother and the child is overemphasized in determining future functioning. Mothers are often blamed while fathers are absent. So if there is any problems with a child, typically the therapist would blame the mother for doing it because the mother is the one who's taking care of the child, typically back in the olden days. So then that's a little unfair. That means anything is wrong is always the woman's fault. And then does not relate to contemporary culture. So again, like I said before, women are treated differently, men are seen differently now as well. And so under his time period, generationally, it might have worked or made sense, but not necessarily in the 2000s.